Let's talk about succession rights. We get a lot of questions about how can I inherit a rent-controlled or a rent-stabilized apartment, so let's break it down. Firstly, it's important to distinguish the difference between a rent-controlled apartment and a rent-stabilized apartment. Rent control is a policy that applies to buildings that were built before 1947, while rent stabilization typically applies to buildings built between 1947 and 1974. Rent control is much, much more rare because basically what it is, it's the same person who's been living in their apartment since the 40s and 50s and they've never left. So most rent-controlled apartments are occupied by very elderly New Yorkers. Only about 16,000 rent-controlled apartments left in New York City. When a rent-controlled apartment becomes vacant, it automatically becomes stabilized. These rent-controlled apartments are the ones that you hear about sometimes where someone's been paying $80 a month since 1949. You can inherit a rent-controlled apartment. So if you had a family member that had a rent-controlled apartment, you would have to be living with them for the past 2 years in order to be able to claim succession rights. For example, your grandmother has a rent-controlled apartment in New York City, and you've been living with her for the past 2 years. If she passes away or vacates the apartment, moves to another city, then you would be able to claim your succession rights because you've been in that apartment for 2 years. What you'd want to do is you'd want to send a letter to the landlord by certified mail proving that you've been a resident of that apartment for the past 2 years. Your family member does not need to add you to the lease or do anything before they vacate or before they pass away in order for you to get those succession rights. If you're disabled or you're older than 62 years old, you can claim succession rights after living in the space for only 1 year. When you inherit that rent-controlled apartment, the rent stays the same. So if your grandmother was spending $80 a month, that will be your rent as well. Rent-controlled apartments are very different from rent-stabilized apartments. The landlord does not have to give a lease every single year. The rents are not increasing ever. They don't need to register the lease or the rents with the state. Those are all things that a landlord would have to do for rent-stabilized apartments. Since a bunch of rent law changes in 2019, the succession rights is less relevant for rent-stabilized apartments. That's because an apartment doesn't lose its stabilization status when someone moves out. If you've been living with a family member for the past 2 years in a stabilized apartment, you could still declare those same succession rights as with the rent-controlled apartments. Those are the main differences. You can still inherit rent-controlled or rent-stabilized apartments if you're very, very lucky, but you can still rent stabilized apartments normally in the market. Check OpenIgloo for available listings and see if they have a little rent stabilized tag on them.